name is Sarah McDonough, and I'm the Programs Manager at the Lexington Historical Society. This is a virtual tour of Munroe Tavern. This museum tells the story of the British Redcoats as they used this building as a field hospital on their retreat back from Concord. When we think about the battles of Lexington and Concord, we tend to stop after the British soldiers are chased out of Concord Center. But in fact, they had to make it all the way back to Boston while being chased by most of Massachusetts. By the time the British soldiers made it back here to Lexington, they were on the verge of collapse and desperately needed help. Luckily, they had called for backup out of the city, but those soldiers didn't arrive until later on in the afternoon. So at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on April 19th, you had about 700 to 800 soldiers running screaming through Lexington Center who had already been through several battles over the course of that day, meeting up with another 1,000 soldiers coming out of Boston, being commanded by Hugh Percy, Brigadier General. At this point, they met up here on this hill on the edge of town in Lexington. It was easily defendable. They could shoot cannons down into the town center to prevent the locals from firing at them. And also, this tavern had just opened up. It was owned by William Munroe, who was the orderly sergeant in the Lexington militia. So he was not here to defend it. And because it was brand new, it was full of food, beds, and alcohol that the soldiers desperately needed. So they stayed here for a couple of hours, tending to their wounded and trying to get some sense of order back into their ranks so they could make it the rest of the way down the Bay Road back to Boston in one piece. You can see behind me here some of the soldiers who may have been here that day. These mannequins are dressed in authentic uniforms supplied by local reenactment groups. And you can see the different types of soldiers that would have been here that day. If you followed the story of Lexington and Concord, you'll have heard a lot of technical military terms. People say things like light infantry and grenadiers. These are essentially the special ops of the British Army that were sent out that day for certain tasks. The light infantry were the younger, smaller, and more agile members of the British Army. And they were able to go out into the fields and skirmish with the Americans, doing some of the guerrilla warfare that we were used to out here. The grenadiers, like the gentleman behind me, were the tallest and most imposing members of the British Army. In theory, you had to be 6 feet tall to join, and you'd be given a bearskin cap on top of that. Back in the 17th century, grenadiers actually did throw hand grenades, which is where the name comes from. And you can imagine what it would be like to have a wall of 7-foot-tall bright red behemoths lobbing bombs at you. But by the 18th century, people realized that bomb technology back then was not good enough to prevent the soldiers from blowing themselves up, and so they used muskets just like everyone else. But the name stuck around. The British Grenadiers is still a very popular fife and drum tune. We're here in the tap room of the Munroe Tavern. It looks a little bit different from the one in Buckman Tavern, if you've seen that, because there is no bar in this room. The Munroe family actually lived in this house long after it became a tavern, and in fact were caretakers here for many years, even after the Historical Society acquired the building. In fact, much of the furniture that you see in this house came from the Munroe family, who have always been very generous in preserving their own history. We'll hear some of their stories a little bit later on in the tour. But down here, I'd like to continue to say a few words about these British soldiers. I do hope that by the end of this tour, you'll feel a little bit sympathetic to them, because they really did not know what they were getting themselves into when they set out that night. And of course, by the time they made it here to this tavern, they were completely exhausted and frankly, I think very confused why an entire colony was firing at them. They certainly had their problems in Boston, but out here, I think they were a little confused just how far this entire revolution had gotten. Now, in this room, we may not have had some of the officers, like in the other room, going over their battle plans. We would have had surgeons throughout the house, of course. Many of the soldiers who were here were not able to be treated along the battle road because they were moving too quickly. And in fact, one of the only primary source accounts that we have from these soldiers is from a young man of the 10th Regiment of Foot named Jeremy Lister. Now, he was an ensign, which means that he carried the flag. So he was a low-ranking officer, but But even when he was shot through the elbow at Merriam's Corner in Concord, he wasn't able to get looked at by a doctor until he made it all the way back here to Lexington, nearly 10 miles away. He wrote about this in his autobiography later on, describing how horrific the surgery actually was, because of course a shattered elbow is no walk in the park in any century. He said that from the long fatiguing march and loss of blood for 9 miles, and want of provisions, not having had a morsel since the day before, he began to grow rather faint, which is a very British way, I'm sure, of saying that he screamed very, very loudly. Now, when the Munroes actually came back to their home that day, they found that the place had been ransacked. William, of course, was out the entire night with the militia. He was actually part of the armed guard outside of the Hancock Clark house, making sure that no strangers came in to accost John Hancock and Sam Adams. So he actually left his wife Anna and their 3 small children here in the house. When the soldiers first came through, they fled out the back door, leaving the house in the care of a neighbor named John Raymond, who had some sort of injury and was unable to fight that morning. Of course, this is not the type of person that you necessarily want to entrust your house with when there are 1,800 armed soldiers there. And unfortunately, poor John Raymond was not able to run away fast enough from the soldiers, and he was gunned down in the backyard. He was our only civilian casualty that day. So when the family came back, they not only found that the floor was covered in blood, all of their food, all of their alcohol had been left and used up, but that their neighbor and friend was dead. So we're upstairs now in the Monroe Tavern, and we're in 2 rooms that would have been off limits to the public. Much like the Buckman Tavern, the attic space here was used for overnight travelers when the tavern was in operation, and the 2nd floor was used by the family. So the door I just walked through would have been locked most of the time. The room we're standing in right now belonged to the Monroe family children. There were 6 in total, 3 boys and 3 girls, but right now the room looks a bit more feminine than most. Of course, women tended to stay in the home longer than men back in the day, with high school not really being a thing in the 18th century. Boys at a normal high school age in modern day would have been leaving home to take an apprenticeship or to go to college. But certainly no one is forcing a 14-year-old girl to get married, even in the 18th century, and so many of them stayed in the home. The most important in this family is Anna Munroe. She's the oldest daughter of the family and the family storyteller. Of course, this painting was done many years later. Anna was only 4 years old during the battle, but she is the one in the family who gives us the most information about what it was like growing up in this house. From the battle, really all that she could remember was being dragged out the back door by her mother, being terrified and hearing the cannons, and knowing that the rest of her life her mother would sit Anna on her lap and say, "This is my little girl that I was so afraid the redcoats would get." Of course, there were other family members who were older who also gave us some really great information from this time period. Much like at the Hancock Clark house, a lot of the information that we have about this family comes from the women. While they weren't necessarily in the thick of the battle, they were writing about the more personal side of the war and giving some really great details that we wouldn't otherwise normally have. Just next door was a cousin to the family, Mary Munroe Sanderson. She was an adult at the time, and her husband was also off fighting. She eventually went with some of the other Munroes to the other side of town to hide, and when she came back later that afternoon, she found a British soldier lying in her bed. Now, Mary was, by all accounts, something of a spitfire, and when her husband came back, he found her raining an incredible amount of obscenities upon this poor man, who was too weak to get up and walk out the door. Eventually, he convinced her to give the poor man some food, but at that point Mary had made herself so terrifying that the soldier asked that Mary's husband taste the food first to make sure that it wasn't poisoned. Mary lived to an incredibly old age, and she is one of the only people from the Battle of Lexington that we have a photograph of to this day. Normally, this was the master bedroom in the 18th century, but right now this is set up as a small private dining room. It's representing just one day in this tavern's history, November 5th, 1789. This is where Anna's story really comes full circle. At the time, she was 18, still remembered the Battle of Lexington vividly, and her family home was chosen to be a stop on the first ever presidential tour of the United States. When George Washington was first chosen to be president, we really didn't know how to react to having a president. It had never happened before. And George was unsure if people all across the country would trust him, a rich Southern plantation owner. And so, like a good politician, he decided to take a national tour. He would shake some hands, kiss some babies, and show everyone that he was a normal person just like them, and that he would do a good job of running the country. So he started up north and made his way back down. He really wanted to come here specifically to Lexington to see where the first blood was spilled in the Revolution, and William Munroe was his official tour guide. We have a portrait in this room of William later in life, so you can have an idea of what he might have looked like. Later on that afternoon, George came back here to the tavern to dine. Unfortunately, Anna did not write down what she actually cooked for the president, but we do have some really fun stories of what it was like for him here. Anna, of course, as the oldest, was put in charge of this whole ordeal. While her stepmother was downstairs cooking, Anna was the one physically bringing the food up here and serving it to George Washington and her father. Her younger sister, Sally, who was 16, was standing between the windows at the front of the house, acting as kind of a butler. And the third sister, Lucinda, who was only 13 years old at the time, was stuck downstairs doing the dishes. Anna recalled that her mother told her that if she spilled a drop of food, George Washington would never speak to her again. So this was probably one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of her life. And it was really like having a celebrity come to your house. George would have sat right here in this chair. At that point, it was probably just the largest one in the house. It's nothing too important, but it has since become a family relic. Anna's granddaughter, Laura Brigham, stated that she used to be plopped in this chair as a child by Anna and told that she could never tell a lie again after sitting in it. So the celebrity of George Washington started very early. And in fact, when Mrs. Munroe called all the children to the table later on to clean up the remains of the feast, Anna was uncertain if they should actually even touch it. Of course, Mrs. Munroe, who probably spent a great deal of money on this, told the children that they shouldn't care about this because the food that was left over was the food that George hadn't actually touched. But Anna said, "Mom, he looked at it. It's holy." The other important thing, of course, in this room is our portrait of Mr. Munroe's father. So this is William Sr. here, and we believe that this portrait was hanging somewhere in this house on the day of April 19th. And we're not entirely sure where it was hanging, but we do know that the British soldiers were aware of its presence because at some point someone during the day potentially used it for target practice. It has been patched up over the years, but right here in Mr. Munroe's arm, there is a tiny patch that is the exact same size and shape as a British musket ball.